We wanted you to come today, and you wanted to come today to talk about, because we are 3 weeks out from the election now, right?
Not far.
Really close.
Yeah.
So many really important issues on the table. Democracy is on the ballot, as they keep saying. I mean, we're not really joking around. There's a lot of important things. And you wanted to talk about research that you're doing that relates to how what we do here in Hollywood impacts those issues in the real world.
Absolutely.
So, tell us about that research and why you think it's important.
Right. Well, Sharon, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and be back in person. Right.
Yes, nice.
It's so nice. But really, when
I feel like I've been on 20 Zooms with you in the past 3 years.
I know.
Ridiculous.
It's great to be face to face with all of you. But I think that we have a really important message, which is why it was imperative to be here. So when Roe v. Wade, the announcement, when Dobbs' decision came down and the overturning, my staff was just eviscerated emotionally, like so many of us, right? And what I actually did as a leader was I gave everyone the day off. I said, go home. This is tough. If you're here and you want to have a conversation, let's do it. And then we regrouped the following week, and I really came back saying, what can we do? And what we can do is we can look at how Hollywood is doing, telling stories about issues that are fundamentally important to our democracy, to our rights, but to the future of where we're heading, not only in this country, but globally as we lead. And so what we're doing at the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative is we're looking at stories and how they focus on or erase altogether, which is really important to this conversation, reproductive justice, issues of reproductive rights, marriage equality, because that is also right now of a concern, interracial relationships and stories, voting behavior, and gun violence. And what we're going to do is
voting behavior.
When do we see gerrymandering discussed, right? When do we see things that are really important and the freedom that we should have, when are those actually part of the DNA of stories? And this is really thinking about entertainment as education, but with the best storytellers in the world, right? How can they tell those stories in really powerful ways? Because one of the reasons it's important to punctuate this is without women and people of color and other historically marginalized communities behind the camera, we haven't seen these stories in the capacity that we need to. And we know that stories can change attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions about a variety of different issues. So we want to work with Hollywood to help them understand the gravity of the situation, which I think they do, but that now we need it in storytelling, because that can reach anyone, anywhere, on any screen.
Well, tell us, what are you actually researching?
Sure.
Because I know that we were hoping to have the results, but you don't have them yet. But I still think we'd like to know, and we'll write about it on the TheWrap when you have the final results. But what are you actually studying?
Right. So any particular issues that will face reproductive justice. So a lot of times people just look at, let's say, contraceptive on screen or abortion storylines. Well,
are there abortion storylines?
Very few. Very few. I mean, you might see them in other countries, but in the U.S., the panel yesterday was very instructive on this. They often focus on trauma, right?
You watched that panel?
Yeah, of course.
It was fascinating because they were saying, Kristen Schaffer from Women in Film was saying that they actually try to count the number of films, shows that say things like abortion.
Yeah, when do they happen?
There's very few.
Right, so it's not normalized, it's not part of, typical storytelling, largely because women and people of color aren't behind the camera, right? If we had fixed this 20 years ago, we would be in a different situation today, because we would have more normal stories that people have experienced. And so with reproductive health, what we're doing is we're looking at sexual scenarios on screen and talk about sex. And all the places where reproductive justice could have been mentioned, where was it? Now, this isn't a heavy-handed approach. Entertainment is fascinating when it comes to doing this well. I ask my students all the time, when Ross and Rachel, from that little show Friends, that many of you might have seen or not seen.
Or heard of.
Right. When Rachel tells Ross that she's pregnant, the most hilarious conversation ensues about condoms only being 97% effective, right? undergraduates in my classroom know that scene. That show was on how many years ago? It's
20.
phenomenal writing. It's comedy at its best. Rewatch it on YouTube. That's what we want to work with the entertainment industry. How do you tell stories about reproductive justice, abortion, contraception, all the options available to someone within sexual scenarios in a way that's compelling to the audience? And we kind of have this secret dynamo working with us. Karen Spruck from Planned Parenthood is our advisor on the reproductive justice work, and she's been instrumental in working with screenwriters, directors, producers for years. Typically has a big event at Sundance. So we're going to profile what's there, what's not there, and what were the missed opportunities so that Karen can follow up working with showrunners and writers to get these storylines embedded in content before we have the next presidential election.
One thing that's interesting, gun violence is another important issue, but I mean, you could argue that you don't need to sway public opinion on this issue. Public opinion is pretty firmly, in a vast majority, in favor of, well,
Right.
Some abortion rights, if we're going to start with that, and some reasonable common sense restrictions on guns. So do you really think that storytelling is what is needed? Because it's in some ways it's the logjam in Washington and the gerrymandered districts and the Supreme Court kind of takeover by the religious right.
Phenomenal question. Yes, I think it's imperative. So, and the reason why is, what group doesn't go to the polls? Young people.
Mm-hmm.
College students aren't going in the numbers that they need to, right? Because they have completely different views on all of these topics than other generations, right? They're far more progressive. Inclusion's just a way of life. They don't even talk about it because that's just their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to reproductive justice, we need them to vote. And one of the best ways to get them motivated and going is through storytelling. Data doesn't do it by itself, but tell a compelling story about why they need to show up. I remember when Trump was elected, one young gal was in our lab sobbing at the outcome. Come to find out, after all the sobbing, we asked her about voting. She said, "I didn't vote." Now, that's an anecdote, but the evidence supports that we need college students, which is why we're giving away about $100,000 in scholarships to directors in film school that want to tell stories about reproductive justice as short films, any film school across the country. Why? Because we want those stories told in the South. We want those stories told in the Midwest. We want those stories told in Southern California so that it gets college students talking and ultimately gets them to register and gets them to vote on issues that are aligned with the rest of the nation and the majority.
Mm-hmm. So what are the issues that are in your study? Like, it's not just reproductive
Right.
choice.
So we'll be looking at reproductive justice, also gun violence. As you mentioned, we have a huge problem in entertainment. We know from 60 years of research, it's not debatable. You might think it is. Exposure to media violence contributes to aggression, fear, and desensitization. Story closed. The relationship between media violence and aggression is just shy of the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. So I think it's...
how do you sorry, but not to be annoying.
Sure.
How do you define aggression?
Physical intent to harm that causes pain or injury or suffering to the victim. That's my background. Actually, I am a media violence researcher by training that got a phone call from Gina Davis and started doing research on inclusion in 2005. And so for us, gun violence is really a problem because weapons effects, if you see a weapon on screen, it primes aggressive thoughts and it can increase the likelihood of somebody acting aggressive immediately after or teaching aggression. We haven't seen a big report card on violence to the industry in a long time. Norman Lear just put out a study on gun safety, but what about gun use? And is that increasing over time? Because everything that we're seeing, whether it's the aggression towards different community groups, immigration issues when kids were being shown in cages, all of these stories and the components of these stories have an impact on attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs. Of course, I mentioned we're looking at voting. We also have to look closely at LGBTQ issues. People think and tell us all the time, there's so many stories about the LGBTQ community. That's actually not true. If you document the last 600 popular films, there's been really no change in the percentage of individuals from that community. And if you're talking about the transgender community, I think there's 4 portrayals out of 600 movies. 4? And so for us, if marriage equality, which if you look at the research, it's really exciting. Will and Grace, there's a direct line
No
between
doubt. No
Will
doubt.
and Grace
Nobody
and
would doubt
marriage
that.
equality.
Yeah.
How do we help storytellers figure out they not only can be progressive, but their stories can be compelling and show different groups. And we're also looking at interracial relationships, which you don't see a lot of research on that either. And we're seeing some progress, but I'm going to tell you right now, 2022 is bad for behind the camera, particularly for women and people of color. The
Really?
numbers are not good this year.
Really?
Last year they were fantastic, they held strong, but now we're seeing a dipping down effect. And so for us, it's bringing all this work intersectionally. And why I wanted to talk about the study before it came out is we need your help. We want to work with content creators in the industry. Karen is, of course, an amazing advocate. Karen Spruck, the consultant we're working with. But we're here to help. And in this issue, our young people are devastated. They're facing a mental health crisis of epic proportions. None of this helps the direction we're going in as a country. And so if the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative at USC can partner with entertainment folks in thinking about these stories in a smart and effective way, bring it on.
So, for example, if you're there's a screenwriter in this room or they know somebody
Absolutely.
and they want to understand better how they might fold into their writing any one of these issues,
Anyone.
would they? Is there some? Should they reach out to you? Or like, I mean, we're
Absolutely.
talking about practically.
Practically AII@usc.edu, right? That's our direct email that will get us connected. And we have a whole series of professionals that we work with across a variety of different topics. So if the fit isn't right for Karen, we can deploy experts on any of these topics for really smart storytelling that makes a
I
difference.
mean, I know this was the case when they were like they were encouraging writers' rooms not to put smoking into shows and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So
it can make a difference.
I'm
I
sure it
mean,
does.
Bob Iger, he's not a fan of smoking. Disney doesn't have smoking, right? I mean, and you might think, well, there's really not too many effects. No, there's a positive effect. And I'm holding a little piece of paper because I wanted to just make sure I got the numbers correct. But when Magic Johnson disclosed that he was positive for HIV,
Yeah, of course.
1.4 million attempts on hotlines from individuals, and this is back in the day, this is decades ago at this point, calling to find out information about HIV. 4 times the amount of phone calls 90 days after that disclosure. Think about what could happen if storytellers sensitized themselves to issues really facing their audiences and provided them information and the resources at the end of the show to make a call. It's entertainment education. They're doing it around the globe. We should be thinking about it here, because if you meet somebody in their home in a comfortable setting, you're more likely to shift attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs. Mm-hmm. It's just straightforward, not only common sense, but backed up by decades of research. And so if folks want to work with us, that's why I wanted to be here, because I want to encourage that connectivity, because that's how we can move the needle quicker. There's lots of things we can't change, right? There's lots of things that are really, really difficult. Changing the story can happen like that. Right? A new pilot, a new show commission, an idea in the writer's room, writing a screenplay. Media is the one aspect that we can literally change overnight. And so to work with storytellers to get us there, to have a democratic society that cares about one another, that's what the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative is all about.
Very cool. Does anybody have any questions on this topic? There's one back there. Yes, go ahead. You know what? Can we get this gentleman?
Rob Carpenter, UCLA.
Oh, well, your hearing is better than mine.
Hi, Dr. Rob Carpenter, teach at UCLA. But
We'll entertain the question, even though Stacy's at USC. Go right ahead.
I got my PhD from USC.
Fight on.
Fight on.
Way to go.
And so and actually I wrote on this topic, and so the biggest barriers that I saw in terms of showrunners implementing these sort of amazing approaches were ratings and revenue. So how do we convince showrunners that it's not going to negatively impact ratings or revenue, because that's sort of the biggest fear that I see. People saying, well, people are going to run away, or we're going to make less money. So there's a lot of fear and trepidation over the issue.
I think that's a great question. So first off, Sharon made the case that the majority is behind, right, many of these topics.
Well, it seems
right?
that way from
Absolutely.
polling.
So that's one thing. Secondly, the misnomer is Hollywood wants to make money. I don't know if I actually believe that. Because if they would have, our economic analyses, which are the strongest of anything that we've done on inclusion, show the profit associated with inclusive storytelling.
Right.
So if they wanted to make money, they would have been inclusive a long time ago. So it's not about money, right? This is about resistance or the way things have always been done. And so I think it's part changing hearts and minds, it's part evidence-based, and then it's just working with really smart people who have a point of view. And that's where we see a lack of access and opportunity. For some of the greatest storytellers are still being shut out that would be telling these stories had they moved on inclusion behind the camera a long time ago. So collective action has to hit all of these levers for us to make progress in any particular lane. So great, and you have a great program with Yalda at, I think it's Stories and Storytellers, I think that's what it's called at UCLA. So, if people aren't working with us at UCLA, again, another phenomenal think tank doing compelling research on many of these topics.
Thank you.
There's a question here, too.
I can't see, so go ahead.
Oh, I have the mic. Makes it easy. Jay Zabriskie from the Los Angeles Film School. One of the things that I like about our school is that our students are not usually from wealthier communities, and we have a very varied, culturally mixed student. In fact, there's a student of mine who is here today who's doing a documentary on the experience of her Rwandan parents as immigrants here. It's going to be a very compelling documentary, I think. But one of the things I was concerned about is how do we prevent the perception that Hollywood is preaching to
Right.
the country? How do we tell stories that are regionally sensitive, that take into account that, we're not a monolithic society? I think that's an issue too.
Absolutely.
that?
And that's why who's working behind the camera matters, and authenticity and nuance matters. Who's telling that story? I mean, that's germane to the Friends episode that, if any of you go back and rewatch, I don't think anybody would think that was preaching to the choir, nor Will and Grace, because everybody wants to be transported in a mythic tale, right? You want to be swept away. When that happens, you're not thinking about, oh, this is the Academy Awards where somebody's making a political statement, because our students, that's not what they're into. But you give them a story of epic proportion that they can lean into, whether it's a documentary, unscripted, animation. And animation's another vehicle for change that we don't see a lot of inclusion in, and it's a spot that needs a lot of work. These things can happen, but we need great storytellers to do that. And Hollywood still focuses too narrowly on only a certain demographic group that gets to participate. As soon as we open that gate, we'll hear more stories that are different, that we haven't heard before, and change comes with those narratives.
It would be great to really, if it were possible, to track it over time and see, I don't know if you can see voting patterns,
Absolutely.
right? But to sort of,
Absolutely.
if you took kind of the gay marriage issue is a great one.
Right.
We know that Will and Grace had a big impact on that. We also know like Norman Lear's work in the 70s
Absolutely.
had a huge impact on attitudes and changing mores, norms,
Right.
conventions. But could we see that in voting patterns? I think that would be super powerful.
Absolutely, because once we have the data, we can then follow it up with survey and longitudinal work. And what's exciting is I'm going to come back and give you the exclusive on it.
Thank you.
You put
all
us
heard,
here.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
fact check me on this when it happens. But what's important about that is you're exactly right. We can do that. And in real time, give the industry, if people are concerned that it's preaching, they're going to tell us, right? But we can also see these subtle shifts. Even a 1 to 3% shift. Think about this. A 1 to 3% shift in a country of 330 million people. That's huge.
It is.
That's a huge effect, and advertising knows that. So that's the type of work we can do, Sharon, and we can use TheWrap as the platform to help people understand that.
All right. Well, we're looking forward to it.
Okay,
Thank you
great.
so much, Stacy
Thanks
Smith, for being
here.
here. It's great.
So much.